Since starting this channel, I have slowly realized that some folks who have not yet hiked on the Appalachian Trail might not quite understand just how bad the rain can get once they do hike there. I say this because I've seen how more than a few hikers have been demoralized, discouraged, and irritated by heavy rainfall. As I have often said, if we hike enough days on the AT, we'll get clobbered by a bad thunderstorm and/or endure a few straight days of rain and drizzle. Unless it's a drought year, this potentially could happen any time between March and December. I have read the opinion that on the AT, quote, dryness is a myth. It does not exist. I certainly respect the experience that led to those conclusions, and I agree we cannot stay completely 100% dry when thunderclouds are spewing their wrath on the AT, and it's futile to think we can. On the plus side, virtually everyone manages to live through rain on the AT, and that's our top priority, to prevent rain from creating some dire situation like hypothermia. In my younger days, rain soaked me to the skin in the outdoors more than once. Eventually, I learned that if I am determined to achieve it, I can be almost impervious to the effects of rain, particularly on the AT, and we'll take a look at that here. First, we need to ask, what do I mean when I say almost impervious? I mean, I will be inconvenienced, but the inconveniences will not be crippling or terribly annoying. I will keep moving. I will maintain a reasonable level of comfort as measured by AT standards. My safety will not be threatened. It's easy for us to read the advertisements and websites of outdoor clothing and equipment companies and get the idea that we can stay as dry and toasty and comfortable on a place like the AT as we would be at home. I support outdoor companies, but the AT cannot duplicate our cozy house or apartment. Let's start by considering that most AT hikers carry a rain jacket and a tent or tarp, plus a pack cover or a waterproof pack or a waterproof pack liner. In other words, they use multiple pieces of gear as rain protection. My approach has been to make that kind of redundancy efficient enough to meet every potential bad news rain scenario. Given enough time on the AT, almost all of these scenarios will appear. Every rain scenario I have seen, from the mild to the very nasty, involves one or more of these elements. So to review these factors, let's take a 24-hour trip through a list of Appalachian Trail rain scenarios from hell. It's 7:30 p.m. in the summer. We're walking to a shelter or campsite about an hour ahead. The skies to the west are solid black with dark clouds. Winds are about 15 miles an hour with gusts even stronger. The forecast on our smartphone says 100% chance of rain tonight. Looks like the rain will get an early start and it will be bad. One option is to stop right now and pitch our tent. We might even try this tactic in the middle of the day if we see or hear a nasty storm rolling in. At one time, I never thought about looking for stealth camping spots until I needed one. On my last section hike, I got the idea to keep an eye out all day long for possible stealth camping spots to see how many I would find. In one 7-mile stretch, I spotted about 10, about half of them right next to the trail. Some, like this one, were not clearly visible from the trail. I noticed this one only because I couldn't see the bottom of the trees when looking uphill, which suggested it was flat up there, which it was. Such an exercise, I think, can sharpen our eye and help us spot stealth spots we might otherwise overlook. Or let's say it's raining hard when we find a stealth spot, campsite, or shelter. Many shelters are close to springs, and to reach some of them, we have to take a long downhill walk on a side trail to get there. If the shelter is full and we see nothing but steep slopes all around us, we face a risk if rain comes down in buckets. It might create a sheet of groundwater running everywhere, including our tent site if we find one. I saw this scenario played out in one YouTube video. The rule of thumb is to look for a tent spot at least slightly higher than the surrounding ground. Many tent sites and shelters provide that advantage. Some do not. I prefer stealth sites on the top of hills or ridges where I typically find flat spots. There might be wind, but the risk of flooding there is pretty much non-existent. Wherever we are, if it's raining bad and we have to pitch a tent, we have two choices. We can stand and wait a while to see if the rain eases, or we can set up camp. If it's the latter, the faster we can pitch that tent, the quicker we can get inside it, which is a particular advantage when strong wind is blowing heavy rain all over creation. Whatever tent we have, it helps to have practice pitching it. If we are forced to adjust any guy lines, that will take time. If we find our tent a challenge, we can check YouTube to see if anybody else has found quicker ways to pitch it. If we have a freestanding tent that has to be pitched before the fly can go over the top, we'd better work extra quick. I earlier told how I modified my gatewood cape so heavily I could be accused of half butchering the thing. I did that so I could pitch it as fast as possible. If my physical condition had not forced me to lighten my pack, I would still be using my homemade pyramid tent. If necessary, I can stake down the four corners, crawl inside, put a trekking pole in the middle, and that's it. Done. No guy lines, no nothing. If I have a few more seconds, I'll put in 8 stakes to prevent sagging. This thing weighs 20 ounces without stakes. I did a video on how I made it, the link's in the description. With the pyramid and the gatewood, I pitched the bottom of the walls right on the ground. The idea of strong wind blowing rain half sideways worries me because I've been through it. By opening the pyramid door about a foot, I've spent nights in the rain with no noticeable condensation. I've also spent nights in the pyramid under blowing snow, and I didn't know anything had happened until I stepped out in the morning. My approach is not the latest in 21st century fashion, but I use a down sleeping bag, and I am determined to keep it dry no matter what. Many modern tent designs elevate the walls off the ground. We can assume, or hope, the manufacturers make them impervious to blowing rain. While I've never seen anyone use one on the AT, a bivy sack is an option if we find a light one and blowing rain worries us. Long ago, I started carrying my sleeping bag and a plastic garbage bag in the pack to absolutely guarantee it stayed dry. One idea was if I was worried about the foot of the bag getting wet overnight, I'd stuff the sleeping bag foot in with me inside it into that plastic bag. I've also figured that if I ever get muddy up to the knees and I'm too worn out to change clothes, I'll just stick my legs inside another garbage bag and put the sleeping bag over me like a quilt. Putting a big ground sheet under our tent seems like a good idea, but rain will cause trouble if that sheet sticks out under the walls of the tent. If that happens, the sheet will catch rain, and odds are very high that water will run right under the tent. What if we have to make an outhouse trip in pouring rain in the middle of the night and there's no outhouse? I used to carry a small umbrella and would still carry one if not for the pack weight issue. I replaced it with a disposable plastic poncho. Most of these weigh about 2 ounces or less and cost a couple of dollars. I used one last September and am convinced I can use it repeatedly without tearing it up. A long time ago, I learned my lightweight gear is quite durable if I can avoid dragging it over rocks or through brush. It only took a small amount of attention to keep the disposable one in one piece. If I was worried about it, I'd carry 2 of them, 3 ounces total. I put the pack on over this poncho. My silk nylon packs go over the pack. If we carry a disposable model, we should unfold it long before we have to use it, because that process can take a couple of minutes the first time we do it. I carry mine in a sandwich bag. Some of these issues will play themselves out in reverse if we wake up in our tent and rain is pouring down. With a decent rain jacket, we can pack up our stuff inside the tent, put on the jacket, get outside, and strike the tent last. Let's hope our tent stuff sack is waterproof. A plastic bag will help if it isn't. Before I have to cut pack weight, I always use the pyramid tent and a poncho. In morning rain, I fill up the pack inside the tent and put on the poncho. The tent is floorless, so I leave the pack inside when I took the tent down. Then I jam it into a nylon stuff sack. If it wasn't raining too much, I take the poncho off to put on the pack. Putting the pack on under the poncho can be done, but it takes a little advanced practice. These days I use the gatewood cape as both shelter and main rain gear. So if it's raining in the morning, I use the disposable poncho as I put the cape away and set off wearing that. Once we're ready to move out, the overnight rain might have created another issue. If we use a nylon tent, even sil nylon, it might be soaked with water. If it is, it will be noticeably heavier. 1 cup of water weighs half a pound. If the tent is big enough and it's really soaked, it might gain 2 pounds in weight from rainwater. More than a couple of hikers on social media have complained about this. Also, depending on the design, striking the tent in bad rain might get the floor wet. Many hikers who have the money will buy a Cuban fiber tent. One manufacturer tells us Cuban will not absorb water like nylon will. I never found a soaking wet tent to be a problem on the AT because I have used only floorless tents that are very light. Like I said, the Pyramid tent weighs 20 ounces and the modified Gatewood weighs only 10 ounces. Hikers can use whatever tent they want. I am aware that for some folks in the 21st century, floorless tents are a confusing and frightening idea. I started backpacking at 11 years old, and that was not recently. At the time, you backpacked with a tarp or a floorless tent, or you stayed home. Those days we managed to live through it. Since then, the woods have not changed. If our tent site has enough elevation, heavy rain will run off the walls of a floorless tent and soak into the ground. Any sheet of plastic big enough will make a ground cloth that keeps us clean. Centipedes and wolf spiders may be common in civilization, but they're hard to find in the woods. If a mouse wants to get into a tent, he'll just chew his way in despite a floor. I've seen only a handful of wild snakes since age 11. Only one was venomous, and he moved off when he saw me. When my daughter saw me using a floorless tent, she crawled into one on the AT without a second thought and had no problem. If we hike in areas with tons of mosquitoes, we can buy bug net on Amazon and make our own tent insert. Most manufacturers who make tarp-type tents will sell us a net liner that fits that tent. I should point out that before I first visited the AT, I used several modern tents in very nasty conditions during late fall bow hunting trips. Trying to keep the tent floors clean and halfway dry amid rain, mud, and snow drove me up a wall. It was that experience that led me to make my own tent, which eliminated those frustrations with a single stroke. If it's been raining bad and it's still raining, in some places on the AT we'll be hiking in water up to our ankles right on the trail. Wet feet increases the risk of blisters. My answer to that is always to wear 2 thin nylon socks on each foot. This reduces friction because any rubbing that happens is between the 2 layers of nylon. When the rain stops, those socks dry out as fast as we could hope for. I've had wet feet and socks in freezing weather on a trip close to home, and it didn't feel bad at all as long as I kept moving. But that changed fast when I stopped moving. I put on dry socks, put the wet socks in a freezer bag, and had it in my sleeping bag overnight. The goal was to avoid frozen socks in the morning. I have tried thick synthetic socks on the AT, but they stayed wet for a couple of days after the rain stopped, even tied to the outside of my pack. Maybe some modern brands will perform better than that. My pack gets wet only rarely, but when it does, I don't worry about it. It's not waterproof, but everything inside that needs to stay dry is in plastic. Some years ago, I used a heavy white trash compactor bag, but I didn't really care for it. I changed my mind about plastic bag liners when I bought a set of 2 clear ones from Gossamer Gear. $5 a pair in 2018, about 1 ounce each. My pack is usually a disorganized mess, but with a clear liner I can pull it out and locate items inside without having to dig through it or completely empty it. When rain begins to fall on a hot summer day, the immediate response of more than a few long-distance AT hikers is to do nothing. That's because rain sometimes starts with a few drops, and those hikers will wait to see how bad it gets. Part of the thinking is they are already wet because they are sweating badly. They typically only wear the minimum of clothing, for example, shorts and a sports bra for women. Another detail is many of them know if they put on their rain jacket, they will get even warmer and probably sweat more. So they wait until putting the jacket on is the lesser of 2 evils. As near as I can tell, the great majority of those setting out on a long AT hike carry a rain jacket. Some outdoor jackets are advertised as water resistant. I would pass on those and pick one that assures me it's waterproof. Some of the latter have zippered openings at the armpits for ventilation. Some hikers on YouTube have lamented that their jackets lack those openings, so they sweat badly and get overheated. Like I said, I am determined to endure rain, and I'm not kidding. If I was overheated in such a jacket, I would pull out a knife and cut open the seams at the armpits. And if weather eventually turned cold, I would grab some duct tape and close the holes. Others can avoid such extreme steps by selecting a good jacket in the first place. One downside is that really effective rain jackets probably won't be cheap. As I've said before, prioritizing how we spend money on gear is not always easy. Whether expensive jackets completely solve the ventilation issue is a question that can be answered by those who use them. I don't use a rain jacket in hot weather, but in the cold rain of March, April, or November, I certainly would carry one. I have a $20 Frog Togs jacket, and so far it works in cold rain. For the price of a first-class rain jacket, I might be able to buy 10 Frog Tog jackets. I got mine at a Walmart, so they aren't hard to find. I can get sweaty hiking in quite cool weather, but if it's below 40 degrees, it's less of an issue. Even so, if I was out in the winter all the time, I might upgrade to an expensive jacket. I will admit that a nice rain jacket certainly can be a fashionable piece of attire. I'm not sure anybody would say that about a rain poncho. Maybe everybody is going to look like a nerd wearing a rain poncho. Even so, a poncho is my first choice in hot weather because they work so well. My last section hike was September 2017. One morning, rain was pounding hard on the roof of the shelter I was in, and a southbound thru hiker walked up. She removed her poncho, hung it on a peg, and started eating an energy bar. She told me, "This rain is not as bad as it sounds." I knew what she meant. Rain isn't that bad under a poncho. My ponchos keep my shirt, shorts, and pack dry, and I've never gotten soaked with sweat while wearing one. As I've said before, every decent poncho I've seen has loops or grommets at the four corners. I tie pieces of cord at the back two corners, pull those in front, and tie them at my waist. That keeps it in place in strong wind. It keeps it from snagging on branches if there are any branches. If we've never used a poncho, it can take a couple of minutes to figure out how to put the thing on. So my advice is to practice how to do that in advance when it's not raining. The cords I tie on mine help me pull it over my pack behind me. It can rain pretty bad on the AT or anywhere else in the East in March and November, and it can get quite cold. Like I said, I'm ready for the worst because plenty of times that's what happens. For that reason, I would hesitate to carry a down jacket on the AT. My first choice would be a modified fleece hoodie I talked about in another video. Links in the description. Unlike down, fleece can get pretty wet and still provide insulation. Some say they can wring out soaking wet fleece and it will still work. In the drier American West, down is a pretty safe option, and if by some chance I had a rain jacket that could convince me to abandon the poncho, I'd feel better about using a down jacket on the AT or anywhere else in near freezing rain. If I've been through a lot of rain, I dry everything out the first chance I get. This helps prevent mildew. Under the summer sun, about 30 minutes usually does the trick. I've also dried out wet stuff by spreading it around in a motel room. Almost everyone carries a smartphone. In September, I had a signal almost everywhere I went. In the description is a link to weather forecasts along all of the AT and all of the Pacific Crest Trail. If we have the money and want to hide out in a town to avoid a forecasted storm, why not? But I cannot imagine we'll be in a position to do that consistently every time rain strikes. One more detail. Heavy rain on the AT can create a high water hazard at creeks and rivers. This is particularly true at the trail's northern end, where rivers with some frequency have been impassable. The AT Conservancy says hikers should not try to swim or ford the Kennebec River in Maine. They should use the ferry, which operates on a schedule. There's a link in the description about more on Kennebec and other AT water crossings. And with that, we're once again done. Thanks to my loyal viewers. Please subscribe if you haven't done it yet. Let's stay dry out there, and thanks a million for watching.